A jetliner plummets to Earth in the Swedish Arctic.
Mayday, 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 S20E02.
Bank angle.
No!
Bank angle.
A deep crater reveals an aircraft in an astonishing descent.
It's just far out of bounds with the way we normally fly the airplane.
Investigators are shocked by what they find.
That can't be what the plane was doing.
I flew the jet for 10 years and never saw anything even remotely like this.
As the evidence paints a terrifying picture of chaos
I don't know, I don't see anything.
and confusion.
If you get past a certain point, that confusion can become terminal.
Why did he let the captain fly the plane into the ground?
"33,000 feet above the border between Norway and Sweden, a CRJ200 jet cruises on autopilot during a late-night mail run for one of Sweden's largest cargo companies, West Air Sweden.
We are approaching Bodø, where the outside air temperature is a balmy -61 Celsius. Fuel?
The 42-year-old Spanish captain has more than 3,300 hours of flight time.
Holding at -30. We're good.
His French first officer is 33, with a similar number of flight hours.
Sweden 294, clear direct development. Expect a circling approach to runway 01 at Tromsø.
Roger. Circling approach for runway 1.
Air Sweden 294.
The experienced flight crew took off from Oslo, Norway, just after 11 o'clock for a 1.5-hour hop to Tromsø, high in the Norwegian Arctic. The cargo jet is carrying about 4.5 tons of mail to the remote northern community. The CRJ200 crosses into Swedish airspace as it heads further and further north. Sean Pruchnicki is a pilot who flew the CRJ200.
I like the airplane because it has all the bells and whistles. It's just as sophisticated as any of the larger jets. The aircraft itself is very fast. It's a very sleek airplane, so it's a lot of fun to fly.
Ready for the approach briefing? Let's do it. ILS approach to runway 01, inbound heading 009.
It's been a routine flight, and the plane is expected to land in Tromsø in about 30 minutes.
Climb and turn right.
Acknowledged.
And according to last ATIS, we can expect light wind and 0... What the hell?
Suddenly, the captain sees his plane is in a steep climb. He pushes the nose down.
What? What?
Come up!
Terrain. Pull up.
Come up!
Obstacle. Bank angle.
Come on, help me.
Bank angle.
Help me.
Bank angle.
Yes, I'm trying. Turn left.
Bank
Turn
angle.
left.
Bank angle.
The pilots can no longer make sense of what the plane is doing.
Bank angle.
Mayday, mayday, mayday!
Air Sweden 294.
Mayday, mayday, mayday!
294, understood, mayday.
What is the nature of your emergency, please?
The plane loses almost 10,000 feet of altitude and speeds towards the ground at more than 450 miles an hour.
Bank angle. Bank angle. Bank angle. Bank angle.
Come on, you need to climb. Come on, you need to climb.
Yes, you need to climb. Turn left, turn left!
No, continue right.
Bank angle.
Continue right.
Okay, damn it!
Come on, help me. Help me,
I
please.
don't know, I don't see anything!
Bank angle.
At 8,800 feet, Flight 294 falls below radar range.
Good God.
Bank angle.
What? What?
Bank angle. Bank angle.
No, no, no.
West Air Sweden Flight 294 hits the ground at almost 600 miles an hour. The plane is obliterated. It takes 3 hours before rescue helicopters arrive. Even from the air, it's obvious the pilots could not have survived.
The information we got from the rescue efforts was that the aircraft was found and also that the accident was most probably not at all survivable.
The crash site is in one of the most desolate places on Earth.
The accident location was in a flat valley in mountainous area. The site was at the time very cold, with temperatures down towards minus 25 degrees Celsius.
The next day, a team of investigators from the Swedish Accident Investigation Authority, known as the SHK, arrives at the crash site. The team includes technical investigator Tony Arvidsson. This far north, they have a very short window to find clues as to what caused the sudden crash of Flight 294.
We only had daylight time for about 3 hours.
Investigators waste no time, analyzing the wreckage to pinpoint the northbound plane's orientation as it crashed.
That's the front of the plane. So, they were traveling east.
Finding the four corners of the aircraft confirms the theory.
The tail, the nose, the wingtips, the aircraft had impacted the ground in an easterly direction.
This is the left wing, all right.
But it's in the wrong place for a plane flying east. This is Arvidsson's first clue about the accident. The left wing is found in the south end of the crater, and the right wing is in the north end. For a plane traveling east, it should be the other way around.
If they were coming in this way, and the left wing is over there, and they must have been upside down.
The crash has also created a crater 20 feet deep. That tells investigators the plane hit the ground at tremendous speed.
They definitely came in hard and fast.
That's not normal. You probably don't have a lot of control over the aircraft at that time.
The position of the wreckage and the size of the crater paints a picture of a plane hitting the ground off course, upside down, and at a blazingly high speed. Incredibly, both of the plane's black boxes survived the crash. They're sent to France, where the data can be downloaded. Investigators hope the data will shed light on why the plane was so badly out of control. As they continue to scour the site, blackened mail from the cargo hold presents a grim possibility.
Could we be looking at a fire? An explosion?
A fire or explosion on board could explain why the plane became so badly out of control while cruising at 33,000 feet. The team gathers as much of the cargo debris for analysis as they can.
Okay, those two boxes and everything in here. Let's get it all swabbed.
They need to determine whether fire was a cause of the accident.
So we send 1 ton of cargo to a fire expert.
Elevator goes, along with all the control cables. This goes too.
The team recovers a total of 3.5 tons of wreckage.
Mostly parts from the flight controls. We try to get as much as possible from the site.
Vi måste börja med en väldigt noggrann faktainsamling. Den kommer att ta flera veckor och vi kommer inte överhuvudtaget att kunna svara på något händelseförlopp i detalj förrän ganska långt framåt i tiden. Det är veckor.
Before fierce winter weather sets in, investigators must abandon the site. They can only hope the cause of this crash lies somewhere in the pieces they're taking with them. Swedish investigators hope the Norwegian air traffic controller on duty the night of the crash of Flight 294 can help explain why the pilots lost control of their plane at 33,000 feet.
Good. Okay, so the first sign of trouble was a mayday call at 12:19.
Mayday, 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 Air Sweden 294, mayday, mayday, mayday.
294, understood, mayday. What is the nature of your emergency, please?
So, no explanation for the mayday call?
No, they never said.
It's just a mayday call like this one with not much specificity, then there's not much the controller can do other than try to discern what's happening and attempt to help.
He was descending quickly and he started to veer east here.
The radar data confirms what investigators observed at the crash site. Flight 294 was descending rapidly and veering east just seconds before it disappeared from the screen.
And the return never split?
No, just one blip all the way down.
The radar shows only one return, meaning it didn't break into pieces in midair.
If you have an airplane that came apart at altitude, you're going to see a lot of different radar returns. If you have one singular return and it doesn't advance forward very much, maybe one more hit and then it's gone, that indicates a dive intact.
The investigators now know the pilots were struggling with a serious onboard emergency.
Thanks for coming down.
But still don't understand what could have caused such a catastrophic loss of control. In Stockholm, the team inspects the 3.5 tons of wreckage for signs of a fatal mechanical failure.
We're looking for a failure of any control surface. Ailerons, elevators, rudder. We need to check them all.
An airplane has 3 primary flight control surfaces. Ailerons that control roll, elevators that control pitch, and a rudder that controls yaw.
Broken flight control, like the elevators, could cause some problems.
But this is the worst damage Arvidsson has ever seen. It's impossible for him to get any useful information about flight control surfaces.
This tells me nothing.
We want to make sure that the control surface is working properly, but it was too damaged.
Investigators try to identify the pieces of wreckage based on serial numbers and other markings to make sure all the control surfaces were on the plane when it hit the ground.
Left and right ailerons, both elevators, rudder. We have them all.
We could find and identify all the control surfaces, which make it most probable that the aircraft was intact all the way down to impact.
They rule out a serious mechanical failure and move on to another theory, that an onboard fire brought down the plane. Tests on Flight 294's cargo don't offer investigators much more insight than the control surfaces.
No sign of fire or explosion.
The cargo was destroyed at impact, not in an onboard fire. Searching for answers, the investigator in charge, Nicholas Seeger, turns to the flight data, now in from France and ready for analysis.
The FDR data for us is really important to understand the course of events. It also helps us to calculate the trajectory of the aircraft.
So they're cruising at 33,000 feet when suddenly they start to pitch way up.
A plane normally changes pitch by about 1 degree per second.
But in this case, you had 6 degrees per second, so it was a really rapid change of pitch.
Then the plane starts pitching down and starts rolling out of control.
We could see this is not normal.
But wait a minute. If the plane is pitching up, why is the altitude decreasing? That can't be right.
When a plane pitches up, investigators would expect it to climb in altitude and its speed to slow. But that's not what the data from Flight 294 shows.
His airspeed indicator was not changing. Same with the altitude. The altitude should have showed a climb if this was good data, and it did not.
That can't be what the plane was doing.
Investigators must get to the bottom of the contradictory data before they can climb in altitude and its speed to slow. But that's not what the data from Flight 294 shows.
His airspeed indicator was not changing. Same with the altitude. The altitude should have showed a climb if this was good data, and it did not.
That can't be what the plane was doing.
Investigators must get to the bottom of the contradictory data before they can climb in altitude and its speed to slow. But that's not what the data from Flight 294 shows.
His airspeed indicator was not changing. Same with the altitude. The altitude should have showed a climb if this was good data, and it did not.
So, no pitch up at all?
Not that we can tell.
The calculations indicated that the pitch was actually going down after the start of the event.
Right here, the data shows a steep pitch up, but the plane flies level and then pitches down. Not up.
What the hell?
It seems the captain thought the plane was pitching up when it was actually flying straight and level. The discovery leads investigators to a disturbing question. Were the pilots responding to an emergency that didn't actually exist?
If they aren't actually pitching up, why are they pushing the nose down?
The indication that the ADI, the attitude deviation indicator on the captain's side, had suddenly shown a 30-degree pitch up is about the only thing that even comes close to making sense for why this crew would take a perfectly good airplane into a dive.
Investigators soon discover that it's not just the pitch data that's off.
Right here, heading and roll are wonky too. You see that?
Yeah. That tells us something.
Yeah.
It's another valuable clue.
When we looked at FDR data, we could see 4 parameters that were not consistent with the other parameters. And those were the pitch, the roll, the heading, and the ground speed.
All 4 parameters come from what's called an inertial reference unit, or IRU. It's made up of gyroscopes that provide information to the cockpit displays and to the flight data recorder. There are 2 IRUs, one for each pilot's display.
The FDR gets its data from the captain's side, IRU.
Investigators study the plane's manuals and electrical drawings.
We found that the IRU-1 was sending the attitude signal to flight data recorder and the primary flight display number 1.
It's an important discovery. The captain's display and the flight data recorder both get their pitch data from the same source.
Now this is what the captain was seeing.
Investigators are coming to a troubling conclusion. The captain's instrument was telling him the plane was pitching up when it was still flying level, and that it was rolling to the right when it was actually rolling left.
The automation is telling him point the nose down, and he's trying to follow this. Unfortunately, it's erroneous information, and that eventually leads to a loss of control of the aircraft. I flew the jet for 10 years and never saw anything even remotely like this.
What the?
It's now clear the pilot was receiving bad information from a faulty IRU. Is it possible the first officer was too?
The FO's instrument has its own gyro.
Investigators learned that IRU-1 was only feeding the captain's instrument. A second IRU feeds the first officer's display and is not recorded by the flight data recorder.
So is it possible that both sides could have failed?
If the first officer's instrument was correct, he should have seen that the plane was flying straight and level. So why did he allow the captain to push the plane into a high-speed dive? To find out, the team recreates the flight in a simulation based on the data from IRU-1.
Okay, start the animation.
It paints an almost incomprehensible picture.
3 seconds after his instrument shows a pitch up, he pushes the nose down.
The pilots tried to solve the problem by pushing the elevators to nose down.
When the captain pushes the nose down, his ADI continues to show a pitch up. So he keeps pushing the plane into a steeper and steeper dive.
Then they begin to roll to the left.
The plane continues to roll until it's on its back.
Eventually they do reach a speed of 508 knots.
It is pretty much incredible that the aircraft did not start breaking up because of the aerodynamic forces, but any control movement at all is going to rip the tail off or going to rip the control surfaces off.
Flight 294 hits the ground inverted at a speed of almost 600 miles an hour.
The speed with which this airplane went from stable flight to a smoking hole, a crater literally, is just astounding because it involves a descent rate at one point of over 20,000 feet per minute. That's a straight vertical dive at almost speed of sound. It means that whatever happened extremely rapidly.
Investigators can now see what happened, but they still don't understand why the failure of a single instrument led to such a sudden and catastrophic crash.
How do you go from level flight at 33,000 feet to 1,000 kilometers per hour impact in, what, 1 minute, 20 seconds?
Investigators are stumped.
The failure of one single instrument in a triple redundant system should allow the crew or the operations to actually cope with this situation.
To better understand how the pilots were interpreting flight data, investigators now turn to the cockpit voice recording of Flight 294.
Let's hear what was happening up there.
Ready for the approach briefing? Let's do it.
Investigators hear no signs of trouble in the minutes leading to the accident, until...
Into last 8s.
Okay, now this is where the trouble starts.
What the hell? What? What?
They're barely talking to each other.
We were a little bit surprised that there were no communication for the first 10 to 12 seconds after the problem started.
For some reason, the two pilots never discussed the unusual pitch.
Come on, help me. Help me. Help me. Yes, I'm trying. Go left. Go left.
Or how to troubleshoot the issue.
Bank angle.
Wait a minute, stop.
Bank angle.
Bank angle. Bank angle. When did this start?
13 seconds after the trouble started.
40 degrees. Exactly when it should come up.
The warning is programmed to sound when the plane's bank angle gets to 40 degrees, which is precisely when it sounded on Flight 294. In a CRJ200, the bank angle display and warning get data from the IRU designated to the first officer's side. Hearing the bank angle callouts gives the investigation some vital information.
Inertial reference unit number 2 was working as it should be.
The first officer was getting good information.
The discovery confirms the first officer should have known the plane was never pitching up in the first place.
So why did he let the captain fly the plane into the ground?
We need to climb and turn right. Acknowledged.
Investigators have a new mystery to solve.
And according to last ATIS, we can expect light wind and 0... What the hell?
When the captain of Flight 294 plunges into a deadly dive, why didn't the first officer intervene? As investigators look at the FDR data, they make an important discovery. The pilots both received what's called a miscompare warning. The warning is shown on both displays when there's a mismatched reading between them. In this case, PIT for pitch. Investigators now know that while the captain saw a sudden 30-degree pitch up, and the co-pilot saw a perfectly level aircraft, both saw the pitch discrepancy warning. It's a puzzling find because pilots are trained how to react to the warning.
You would hope that communication-wise, you'd be able to verbalize, I have what appears to be an extreme pitch up. What are you showing on your side?
I'm showing a pitch up.
In the event of a discrepancy, pilots should check a third standby instrument to determine which side is wrong and switch the faulty instrument to the working IRU.
Looks like my side's bad. Switching to IR2 now.
Ideally, what we refer to as a standby attitude indicator could have kind of broken the tie. In other words, we have 3 sources of information, and the best 2 out of 3 is what you're trained to go with.
All right. Let's see what they say next.
But when investigators listen to the CVR,
We need to climb. Come on,
Yes,
we need to climb.
yes, we need to climb. Go left, go left.
they don't hear that kind of conversation.
Continue right. Okay, David.
Instead, they hear the sound of a crew that can't figure out what's happening to their plane or how to correct the problem.
Come on, help me. Help me, please. I don't know. I don't see anything.
And what that tells us is that the crew members were both very mentally consumed with looking at their primary flight display, trying to figure out actually what is going on. What is the real position of the aircraft in space?
It's a troubling revelation.
What the hell?
Seeger decides they need to see exactly what the pilots experienced when the instruments began to fail. They book time in a CRJ simulator.
Okay, so let's start the air on the left side, please.
They fly the same route as Flight 294 and program a fault into the left side IRU.
In the simulator, we could observe the 2 primary flying displays, and we could also see that everything was working according to design.
There it is. Freeze it there, please.
When the captain's ADI shows a sudden climb, the miscompare warning comes on, telling the captain and first officer they're seeing different pitch readings.
Okay. All right, let's pick it up here.
Then they make a new discovery.
And now we've got the declutter mode kicking in. Freeze it there, please. All right.
When a pilot's ADI reaches extreme pitch or roll values, it goes into what's called declutter mode. All non-essential information disappears, and red arrows tell the pilots which direction to fly.
The declutter mode is to help the pilot focusing on the most important things.
But that's not the only insight the flight simulator provides the investigation.
And guess what disappears in declutter mode?
Investigators learn that in declutter mode, the PIT discrepancy warning alerting the pilots of mismatched displays also disappears.
4 seconds after that warning appeared, it disappears for good.
It's not enough time for the captain to register the problem.
What the hell?
And as a result, he instinctively pushes the nose down, not realizing he's putting the plane into a dive. Soon the first officer's gauge also enters declutter mode. but in almost the opposite configuration of the captain's display.
Come up!
Now, neither one of them has a discrepancy warning.
This is potentially problematic because the crew is still trying to figure out what's going on in addition to following the erroneous automation commands. So this box, what was telling them what the problem was, actually disappears when the situation becomes even more dire.
As the pilots were struggling to regain control of their plane,
Yes, I'm trying. Go left. Go left.
both were missing a vital piece of the puzzle, that their displays were showing different pitch angles.
That's one bit of information that really should not have been removed when it goes to a decluttering function. That was the only cue that they really had that there was potentially a problem between both primary flight displays.
Investigators now have a picture of what happened in the cockpit.
We need to climb. Come on, yes, we need to climb. Go left. Go left. No, continue right. Okay, David.
But to figure out why the pilots couldn't tell if they were climbing or diving,
Come on, help me. Help me, please. I don't know. I don't see anything.
investigators will need to take to the skies. Investigators fly an identical plane on the same route under the same moonless conditions to find out what the pilots of Flight 294 could and couldn't see on the night of the accident.
I could see lights, maybe Ritzum, and I can just see the horizon over there.
We are approaching Bordeaux.
Even when flying at nighttime, there can still be visual cues that can help you understand the orientation of your aircraft. Things like you can still see a visible horizon sometimes when there are a lot of city lights.
The test seems to be in vain, revealing nothing out of the ordinary.
Okay, let's start the descent into Tromsø. Now I can't see anything out there.
It was very, very difficult to discern the horizon during this flight when you had the cockpit illumination on.
Investigators have made a major discovery. With the cockpit lights turned on, it would have been impossible for the pilots to see the lights below or the horizon. The pilots of 294 would likely have depended entirely on their instruments for guidance. Instruments that showed contradictory information.
We need to climb. Come on, yes, we need to climb. Go left. Go left. Oh, continue right. Continue right.
When we can't see outside, we trust our instruments. But if your instrument is telling you something that is completely separate from what your body is telling you, it's not a matter of ignoring one or the other, it's a matter of verifying what the situation is.
The discovery reveals a critical piece of the puzzle.
Ready for the approach briefing? Let's do it.
After the captain of Flight 294 switches on the cockpit lights,
According to last ATIS, we can expect...
his display begins to indicate a substantial pitch upwards.
What the hell?
But glare inside the cockpit means the pilots can't see the horizon below. The captain can't tell if his plane is actually climbing or not.
Had this happened earlier when they might have had some form of a visible horizon, it could have had an entirely different outcome and probably would have.
He sees this, so his first reaction is to push his nose down.
Seeger thinks the captain's response
Yes, I'm trying.
made it impossible for either pilot to make sense of the plane's movements.
Go left.
Bank angle.
One of the adages that we have kind of instilled in commercial aviation and in military aviation is, in an emergency, order a cup of coffee first before you decide to do something. There are very few things in aviation that need an instantaneous physical response.
In less than 30 seconds, the plane is upside down and diving.
Bank angle.
Extreme negative G-forces make the pilots feel weightless, so they can't tell if they're climbing or descending.
When faced with a negative G environment, it's disorienting for many reasons. One of which is that it actually affects your cognitive ability, so your ability to understand the situation that you're in.
In just 5 seconds, his autopilot disconnects. He's faced with a 30-degree pitch up, and his instrument display changes.
Mayday, 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 S20E02, mayday, mayday, mayday.
Investigators believe that the rapid-fire chain of events triggers what's known as the startle or surprise effect in both pilots.
That surprise effect, together with the lack of communication between the pilots, can explain the difficulties there were to solve the problem.
This is basically the environment that they found themselves in, going from extremely normal operations to extremely abnormal operations, basically within a split second.
Go left, go left. No, continue right. Continue right.
Okay, David, help me!
In a lot of ways, this accident is kind of a perfect storm scenario. The fact that both crew members were looking away from their instruments, as they were required to do, briefing the approach, the fact that the autopilot disconnected so quickly, the fact that the indication of pitch was so extreme.
Come on, help me, please!
I don't know, I don't see anything.
Investigators now believe they have pieced together what went so horribly wrong on Flight 294.
No!
But they still have one final question to answer.
Ready for the approach briefing?
Let's do it.
The final minutes of Flight 294 are now clear to investigators.
ILS approach to runway 01, inbound heading 009.
The approach briefing is interrupted when the captain notices a sudden climb.
Light wind and zero. What the hell?
The start of the event was a runaway on the left side pilot flying display, showing an increasing pitch.
But he has no idea what he's seeing is from a faulty inertial reference unit. The pitch warning disappears, the autopilot disconnects, and the captain pushes the nose down, following instructions on his ADI. As the plane begins to dive, the pilots don't know their displays no longer match.
What?
What?
And as they can't see the natural horizon outside, neither pilot can verify their actual attitude. As the plunging jet rapidly gains speed, negative G-forces make the pilots feel weightless. Flight 294 rolls to the left until it banks upside down.
It's possible that this occurred because now the first officer had grabbed the yoke to steady himself or to possibly try to contribute to solving the problem.
Upside down and hurtling to Earth, the first officer's display shows the plane in a nosedive and banking left.
Come on!
Bank angle.
But the captain sees the opposite, a plane climbing and rolling right.
Come on!
His first officer's suggestions make no sense. And the inverted G-forces make it almost impossible to think.
Come on, help me. Help me. Help me.
Yes, I'm trying. Turn left. Turn left.
Bank angle. No.
When you get sucked into a reality in the middle of the night like this, that is not commiserate with what's actually happening, in other words, it's an induced reality, then it begins to get confusing. And if you get past a certain point, that confusion can become terminal.
The plane is in a steep dive, nearly inverted, and traveling at speeds approaching 600 miles an hour.
Once you get to that point, the mind pretty much checks out in terms of giving you good guidance on how to fly the airplane. And after that point, there's just no recovering.
We need to climb. Come on,
Yes, we need to climb. Turn left. Turn left.
No, continue right.
Bank angle.
Continue right.
Okay, David.
Come on, help me. Help me,
I
please.
don't know. I don't see anything.
Bank angle.
What?
Bank angle. Bank angle. Bank angle.
80 seconds from the first sign of trouble, the plane slams into the ground.
There's no training that's typically provided to understand how to effectively recover from a situation such as this.
The final question for investigators will be the most difficult to answer. Why did the inertial reference unit fail in the first place? With more than 9,000 identical units in service around the world, the answer is vitally important. The IRUs have been recovered from the crash site, but they're very badly damaged.
The physical IRU was damaged beyond recognition, and we couldn't find out what caused the problem.
Nothing.
Without the device's memory cards, investigators are unable to determine the cause of the failure.
We tried in every possible way, but we didn't have enough evidence to understand it.
What the hell?
Regardless of what caused it, the IRU's failure should not have caused an accident. There are backup instruments on board for precisely that reason.
Redundancy is one of the keys to aviation safety, because not only do we need redundant pilots, because human beings can fail, but we need redundant instruments. We don't want to ever get in a situation where a single point failure is going to cause you to not be able to fly the airplane safely.
In their final report, investigators list the pilot's failure to communicate properly, the lack of information provided by the flight instruments about the failure, and the effect of negative G-loads on the crew as the main factors causing the accident.
It's important to communicate really early when you got a problem, so the other pilot can understand what's going on.
The investigators recommend that airlines adopt standard call-outs for pilots to use in similar emergency situations, and that manufacturers improve the design of primary flight displays so that important error messages aren't removed in declutter modes.
If you've got more than one crew member, and in almost all instances in airline flights you do, you need a procedure for immediately checking with each other and having standard call-outs so that you are coordinating your actions and coordinating your brains. Here we had one carbon-based brain making decisions that were incorrect and starting a slide into an accident sequence because there was no coordination with the other one.